ये दर्द रहेगा बन के दवा तुम सब्र करो वक्त आने दो.
And just before we begin the next talk is going to be about, why is there suffering? It's a big question, and a poll was done about, if you were to meet God, what would be the first question you ask? And most people said that if we were to meet God, we would ask him, why is there so much pain and why is there so much suffering? So here in Khuddam, we just wanted to answer that question and just get a few different views from different Khuddam, so that we can just collectively answer or get views on the question. But before I begin, I just want to play a small video just to get everyone's minds rattling, and then we can go into a talk by Hamza Sab, inshallah. So small videos are being made by Rational Religion, and I'll just quickly, 1 second. Gotta be quick on
suffering.
1 second.
It's about they're the good people. Well, it's worth remembering that being a good person isn't about not suffering. It's about how you respond to suffering. A good person is someone who, for example, despite perhaps not having that much money themselves, helps others financially, or who makes time for others despite themselves being busy, or someone who stands up for what's right despite opposition. Good people's lives aren't plain sailing, and we admire those who've undergone a struggle. Good people suffer because it's via that very suffering that they prove who they are. Why do good people suffer?
So yeah, guys, if you go into Rational Religion, the page, Mustafa Siddiqui, who's just graduating from Jamia now, was always very keen in these kind of things and tackling atheism. He likes his history, he likes his science as well. So it's a good angle to talk about things. So inshallah today as well, we'll just replicate that, and off the back of the God Summit as well, which was largely about the existence of God, as Qasim mentioned, and which probably affected a lot of people who watched. So it begged the question of why is there suffering. So I'll just hand over now to Hamza, who will, I think, probably has a presentation as usual. So please just the mic's yours, Hamza.
Assalamualaikum everyone.
I
can tell from that poll you said, Murabi Saab, you listened to Azhar Hanif Saab's talk, didn't you?
This is the speech. I love the speech so much, and I just wanted to
I remember one convert, one of the convert stories on Ahmadiyya Answers on his page. He was saying one of the reasons he came to Ahmadiyya, he learned a lot about Malcolm X and those sorts of speakers. And you remember he saw Azhar Hanif Saab for the first time, and he was like, "Who is this man? He reminds me of Malcolm X," sort of thing. Proper inspiring.
Yeah.
So, guys, apologies. I don't think my talk's going to be anywhere near as inspiring as his, but I'll do. and it's quite long as well. So apologies if it's quite lengthy at points. But I'm trying to cover an extract really. With this topic, obviously, there's so many ways to go about it. There's so many different interpretations on it, and so many different ways to answer it. But I really thought the best place to go was Khalifa Arabi's book, Revelation Rationality. I'll put references in anyway. It's about, there's like a 20-page passage in like a 700-page book. It's about literally why is there suffering, and I don't think there's more of a comprehensive reply than these 20 pages. That's why it's a bit of a long presentation, but I hope you guys can take as much as you can from it. And obviously the best thing to do is read it in your own time as well, alongside Azhar Hanif Saab's presentation as well, and so many other good resources on Al-Islam. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we'll start again from that video that Murabi Saab said about, there was a study in America done, as he mentioned. So what would be the one question that people would ask God if they could meet him? And again, based on that survey, as Murabi Saad said, the one thing they would ask God, if people would ask God if they could meet him, is why is there so much pain? Why is there so much suffering in the world? Why do we see it in the news every day? And obviously, as human beings, we're empathetic by nature, and it has an effect on us, doesn't it? For example, recently, the things in Palestine, on the Gaza Strip, all the air missiles and all that sort of stuff, it has an effect on you. And you question, if God is there, why are these things happening to innocent people? And I think COVID as well has played a massive role in making us think, so many innocent lives have been lost, especially in the lockdown last year, and even now as we speak. And we always think, if there is justice, if there is a God, why are these things happening? And we know from understanding Quran and the attributes of Allah, We know he's described as God of mercy, love, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the gracious, the merciful, all these sorts of things. So it sets the scene of why, if God has these attributes, why do these things happen? As a Hanif Saab, also in that interview, he mentioned a narration. I haven't got the actual quotation, so this is paraphrasing it basically, but it's something you could probably research in your own time about a there was a time, I think it was either during a war or a time of great hardship in the time of the Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and there was in that time someone saw a woman. There were various young children, babies. They were crying. They're very upset about something. It may have been a famine, might be in the middle of a war, a time of hardship basically. And the woman was going around lifting up all the babies and looking after them. And then someone said to the Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, "O Prophet of God, look at this scene in front of me. A woman running around on the battlefield, and she's looking after all these children, taking them literally within herself and looking after them." And then she questioned, saying, "Is not God at least as merciful and compassionate as this mother who's caring for every soul in her sight?" So, as we've said, so much trouble in the world, even with good people, with the best of people, with the most righteous people. Why are they suffering so much, and why is there suffering at all? And then taking it from a Tabligh point of view, again, this is something atheists ask as well, and they often argue they can't get a reasonable answer to this question. We obviously as Muslims, we believe that Allah answers this question through the Holy Prophet ﷺ and through his explanations in the Quran. And there's one little passage, one little summary of a verse in the Quran that Azhar Hanif Saab mentioned as well, about his plan for life and his plan for his beloved creation. And this is how it starts: "Blessed is he in whose hands is the kingdom, and he has power of all things," just describing obviously Allah and his relationship with his creation. And then going on more than this, it's Allah will tell us his plan of life over his kingdom, what he has in store for us in this world and the next. So it goes on to say, "Who has created death and life, that he might try you, which of you is best in deeds." So this is, for a person who believes in God, this is the primary thing. The sole purpose of our existence is trials and tribulations of life, to see how we react, what difficulties me and you go through in our personal lives and our day-to-day lives, the good and the bad. The bad, that point of discomfort, of trials, of suffering, helps develop as people and progress both spiritually and in our worldly means as well. We, by nature, we want to avoid suffering at all costs. And this is essential for the progress of humanity, for evolution as well, for the progress of humanity. You need suffering to progress. Without it, life in itself has very little existence, very little purpose. And I'll explain that more in a little bit. The passage from Revelation Rationality. Now, I just want to read this passage first. "We identify the journey of evolution to be a long procession of some obscure realization of gains and losses, which gradually evolve the sensory organs to register the pleasure and pain, comfort and suffering." Basically meaning our senses, how we feel, how we see, all of our senses, they have developed over time for us to interpret what gives us loss and what gives us gain, what gives us happiness, what gives us suffering. And that, without that perception, the purpose of our life, the purpose of our creation is very mundane. It's very without purpose, so to speak. And then if we look at lower forms of life, I put a question at the start: do you want to be that worm beneath your feet? If you think of a worm, in their sphere of life, they don't see themselves to be suffering. What's their role? Burrowing underground, looking for food, etc. But us as a higher form of conscious, as a higher form of being, if someone said to you today, you're going to become a worm, you have a great sense of loss, don't you? From your awareness of what you were as a human being to what you were as a worm, meaning you only have that sense of loss, that sense of suffering, once you know what you know, once you know what you have, once you appreciate what you have. You can't have one without the other, is what I'm trying to say. So that sense of perception led to sensory organs being developed, which led to us perceiving suffering, happiness, pleasure and pain, etc. And this develops more when you have the central nervous system and the brain, and as we've developed over time, really. And then this comes on to this point here: the more we develop, the more our senses develop, the more aware we are, the more heightened our awarenesses of loss is suffering and gain is pleasure. And then just a few more quotations from the book: "The less developed the conscious, the smaller is the awareness of the suffering." Hence the example I gave about the worm. The sensory provision for the recognition of suffering and happiness are indispensable to each other. By definition, you can't have one without the other. You need to know happiness. You need to observe happiness. And only when you understand that, when that's taken away from you, you can have suffering. You can't have suffering. You can't have one without the other. Basically, they exist. They coexist. You can't have one without the other. And they're if you look at a graph, they're like negatively proportional. So if you have less suffering in your life, your capacity to feel pleasure and pain will also be reduced. They're intertwined with each other, and both are necessary for evolution. Again, one can't be done without the other. And then suffering itself is a perspective thing. So again, as I mentioned, absence of happiness is suffering. And then one example I think to give, obviously the whole slides here, but to summarize it, I think if you think of, say, for example, myself, if I say I'm a healthy person, and then I see someone, maybe someone who's asthmatic, from my perspective, that person's suffering. But then someone who's got asthma, he may then see someone who's got cancer. Someone's got cancer who's got X amount of years to live, X amount of months to live. And then from his perspective, the asthmatic person is fine, but he thinks the person with cancer is suffering a lot. It's a very subjective thing, and it's based on your position where you stand. So one person suffering for one person might not be the same for another. And understanding, coming back to the evolution side of it, understanding that struggle for existence, that leads to improvement in the quality of life and helps us to develop. We talk about survival of the fittest, not in the way Darwin said, but the idea that learning from those misfortunes, those things that have gone wrong, help us to improve, develop, and better ourselves as a society. And we see that now through advancements in medicine, technology, etc., etc. Yeah, just this last bit at the end of the slide, that perpetual struggle of life and death. We want to cling to life. We want to exist for as long as possible. And without suffering, you can't have that progress. And then through that progress, it's worldly and spiritual. And we see the highest forms of existence in terms of perfection of human beings. We say that, and prophets, obviously.
I'll stop you there for a second. Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, because we picked up on the point of the worm. And while watching Azir Nifsab's talk, I wanted to take a clip out of it. And for me, that's the one that I could relate to most. So I'm just gonna play a short video, guys.
I'll stop sharing what stuff. I'll just stop sharing. Is that all? Yeah.
Give me a sec, and then we'll just listen to a small video, and then we'll jump back straight into Hamza's talk, inshallah. So yeah, just picking up from what Hamza said. So obviously Azir Nifsab also explained it really well, just as Hamza did, and it's very relatable.
Now, if you know biology and the beginning of origin of life, you know simple single cells. And you think about those simple single cells, what you would say to God is, oh God, I like that life better. I want to go back and be an amoeba, because amoeba didn't feel so much pain as I'm feeling right now. Amoeba don't feel cold, they don't feel heat, they don't feel the pain of loss of a loved one. It doesn't have the same sense of hunger and thirst and the drive to want to do something with the creative talents you have. It's just floating around. It's a simple amoeba. It is happy. So I remember the fourth Khalifa, Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad, Allah bless him always, he spoke about this in his book called Revelation Rationality. And he said, those people who complain of the suffering of life, you ask them, you give them a choice. Would you want to be that worm beneath your feet? Who in a sense is probably quite happy living in its realm of dirt and whatever it's eating, and has lack of sensory perception of a lot of pain as we have. But the poor worm is of a lower consciousness and doesn't feel as much pain as we do. It's not suffering because you ripped that poor worm out of its family system in the ground and took it to the ocean to be used for fish. And so would anyone in this world who's asking God, why suffering, would want to go back to a level where we didn't suffer so much and think that's a better world for us. Think that that's a better plan. God, keep us all at that level of a lower consciousness where we don't have the struggles we have now in the human family. And I'm sure there's very few, even amongst atheists, who would say, yeah, that's a better life. I think that's the way to go. And so we understand from this concept that the trial of life and death is what brought us from that lower organism called the amoeba to what is now the human being and continues to propel us forward on the path of progress and evolution and perfection of our beings. And this is a mercy, a blessing that comes from that being who understood his creation better than anyone else.
So just stop it there. It's just such a brilliant piece. And just listening to that video, I watched that, like I said, I watched it a few times, and I literally could have taken anything from that talk and showed it today. But that's just one clip, guys. If you do have time, do try to watch. It's about a 40-minute talk. And just off the back of that, it makes you really realize, you know, that there's a strong connection between suffering and success and progression. And even today in Huzur's Friday sermon, I know we'll go into the Friday sermon a little later with Zishan. Huzur mentioned a really, really important point, and I was just struck because whenever I'm preparing for something and this Friday sermon, Huzur somehow says something about that topic. I'm like, wow, I can actually use that because Huzur just said it. And Huzur said that whenever something you have lost in life happens, whenever you lost something, don't ever think about that thing you have lost. Always think about in what state you were when you lost it, and were you in a state of doing it for Allah Ta'ala? Were you in a state of doing it in sincerity to God? And if you were, then always remember that whatever you've lost, Allah will always replenish it in some way, even more in a greater form later on. And he said, Hazrat Muslim Maud Rizal who picked up a very beautiful point talking about Hazrat Umar Rizal who he said that this man suffered so much when he became Khalifa. He had so many people against him, so many groups or tribes were against each other, and he had to suffer so much. But because he suffered and he established justice, which prevailed all around Arabia, that same justice we're able to reap the blessings of now and today. And so he said, sometimes when you suffer, you're going to get success and other people will benefit from it. And same with the Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who suffered the most, more than any other person in this world. But you know, look what came out of it, the religion of Islam, and through his example, we are able to recognize the attributes of Allah the Almighty. So yeah, just wanted to throw that point in there. So Hamza, you can carry on with your presentation.
Just throw the rest of the video, man. I'm good. I'll just listen to that.
Good.
Just touching on what he said, just remind me, even Nabil Bhatti Sahib, didn't he say all that difficulty he was going through, and people were feeling so sorry for him, but even said, you know, I'll go through it again.
Yeah.
Because of what Allah showed me, I'd go through it again with a click of the fingers if I could.
That's maybe as in his talk later on in the video, he was like, for a believer, if he even gets, you know, a touch into heaven, Allah will ask him, did you suffer in this world? And he goes, I didn't suffer a single bit, because I've tasted what's to come afterwards. Anything that I felt before has completely vanished. So always have an eye on the bigger picture of what Allah has planned for you. And that's, you know, that's the way to go about it.
Definitely. So then just continuing on from that, again, that struggle provides us with that perpetual drive to keep living rather than to die. And then just reading this again, it may result in the improvement or deterioration, the quality of existence in the wide spectrum of evolutionary changes. This is the essence and spirit of evolution. Hence, all of those trials, or those tribulations, the discomfort, the pain, the hardship, from maybe when we were cavemen millions of years ago to now, it's all had its purpose and it's all had its role in having the heightened sense of awareness that we have now, as Hanif Saab mentioned in a better way. And again, that struggle between life and death that he talked about, it's the means of creating pleasure. This is the primary motivating force which fuels evolution and progress of human beings. That struggle between life and death, and to keep on living, so to speak. Then another thing that, you know, just playing devil's advocate, you might think of like maladies and disease that happen in the world. You see natural disasters, you see earthquakes, you see terrible diseases, viruses like COVID, and the effect that they have on people. But in actual fact, as Muslims, if we think about it on a deeper level, this design, these things that happen, make us more aware of a greater consciousness. If we were to say, for example, take away all the suffering in the world, take away all the kids who are unwell, take away all the bad things that happen, natural disasters, etc., a world of equal happiness, and there's no suffering in that world. Just picture that world in your head if you can. And you can apply this principle at any stage from now to millions of years ago. It doesn't actually work. So as Hanif Subset mentioned, so that in the rudimentary forms of life, you had bacteria, some with which had a nucleus, then without a nucleus, and then you had pyrobacteria, which is another form of fundamental organism at the very start. If they're all equally provided for, one doesn't outcompete the other, one isn't better suited to the other, life would have remained at that state. So there would have been no progress, no development, no change in life. You would have been fixed at that, well, Khalifa Rabi calls it a rudimentary form, so a purposeless existence. And our existence wouldn't occur either, because there was no need for any progress or change, so to speak. And then for those rudimentary forms of life, obviously they didn't have the awareness that we have as humans. And if they had the decision to think, should I live or shall I be destroyed as a cell, they'll probably think not to be, because my existence makes no difference anyway. It's like it's a meaningless existence, so to speak. And suffering can also, again, be linked to that evolutionary change. It can also be linked to retribution and punishment. And you see this in the animal kingdom. Elephants and buffaloes, if you harm their young, their children, you can see in nature, if you watch any nature films, you see they have a propensity to revenge and to respond. This aspect of suffering is also massive in the other thing we always say as humans, we have free will. Without suffering, that option of having free will also goes down the drain to some extent, and it's vital in the decision-making process for human beings. So when we think about what's right and wrong, what's easy and what's hard, in our personal lives, whether we want to improve in whatever we want to do it in, there's a choice to be made. And without that suffering, without that discomfort, it takes away that option of decision and free will in human beings. Yeah, so it takes, without suffering, as humans, we don't necessarily have that free will, if you can ponder over that a little bit. The other thing is, from a different perspective, sometimes suffering is at our own hands. We see, for example, what's going on. For example, in the Middle East, if you think of Yemen, and you see a lot of kids there because of the famine, because of the blockade from Saudi Arabia, you see how many kids are being malnourished, they don't have any food. This suffering, you can't blame this on God. This is human beings acting in a wrongful manner, in a bad manner. This is much of the suffering we see in the world is injustices human beings commit to other human beings. So that's another perspective. Look at it. There's enough food resources for everyone in the world, but human beings being selfish and inconsiderate leads to a lot of suffering in the world. But we don't like to point the blame on ourselves. We like to look elsewhere, so to speak. Other cases that are a bit hard to explain, as I mentioned, children born with congenital defects. I think children, it's always a sensitive topic, and a lot of kids who are born in difficult situations in war zones, we see refugees. It pulls on your heartstrings, doesn't it? And poor innocent children, who are disadvantaged, you think it's not their fault they're suffering. So how you think about that as someone who believes in God, you have to understand not all suffering is a punishment, and not all happiness is a reward. There will always be in the development of man, in the development of human beings, there's always be a small percentage of people who will suffer without justification on the surface. But unfortunately, it's necessary to have such people, because it has a meaningful role in the advancement of society in various different ways. So not every healthy baby is the reward of the good of parents, and not every unhealthy baby is a crime for the punishment of parents. And then again, from Revelation Rationality, Khalifa Rabi puts it in a better way: health and disease, ability and disability, fortune and misfortune, congenital advantages or disadvantages are themselves but indispensable to the grand scheme of things, in which they play a causative role. Suffering is also a great teacher. It helps us to decide what's right and what's wrong, how to treat other people. It also teaches a great deal of humility, where we realize, I think especially in COVID as well, people turn to God a lot more, even non-Ahmadi Muslims, non-Muslims altogether. It makes us realize, despite our advancement, despite our progress, we are still very weak and very susceptible to be wiped off very easily as human beings. It really teaches humility in that way. And then remove that suffering from developing man's potential, and the wheel of progress would turn back 100,000 times, meaning we are here because of suffering and hardship, and we wouldn't be here without it.
Sorry, Hamza, I just want to go to Qasim. Just has his hand raised up. Sorry.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Just wondering, with Islam, do we consider ourselves like as perfect beings, or is that just a Christian concept?
Perfect in what way?
How
Just
do you mean
like Allah made us as perfect beings or
as
something
in,
similar.
Marabi, what do you reckon?
Yeah.
I think the only perfect being that was created was the Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who he himself, of course, was susceptible to human weaknesses in terms of injury, in terms of sleeping. So the only perfect being in reality is God Almighty. But
Okay.
in terms of the only creation which has been created, which has can surpass any other creation, is human beings, because we've been given that that freedom of free will and of making a choice, which other creations haven't been made. So in that terms, we can. I don't think we can ever call ourselves perfect, but we have been put on a path that can lead to almost a perfect end.
Yeah.
Jazakallah.
Yeah, I
If
think.
anyone else has any points to make or wants to raise a question, just by
Yeah.
all
Otherwise, it'll get a bit boring if I just keep hear my own voice. Does anyone else have anything to say?
Yeah, it's good. It's good. Keep going, Hamza.
Um, yeah, and just all scientific discovery. So recently, what the COVID vaccine, all of these things are happening not because we want more pleasure and more success. It's to get away from pain and discomfort. So that's a massive thing. The thalidomide tragedy with going back to the 80s or the 70s when women were having children with various defects because of a problem with the medication. Um, we've progressed from that because of avoiding pain and discomfort rather than trying to get to more pain and more pleasure. Sorry. And then going back to the idea of that child being born with maybe with a paralysis or with damage to the brain or central nervous system, the question you always ask is, why was it my child? Why was it this child? But then if you keep going back with that question, you'd ask, why is it anyone at all? And then the only option left is for Allah to create every baby perfectly healthy or perfectly unhealthy and equally in the same way. But in actual fact, there's no end to that, so to speak. So it's a relative thing, and it's a thing from perspective. So you won't find two babies or two human beings who have the exact same health of mind and heart, and no one's organs are the same, no one's fitness is the same, no one is even identical twins. There are variations. So it's like you can never answer that question satisfying everyone.
Yeah, I think I just want to make a small point here as well, Hamza, because just talking about babies being born, but even just thinking the mothers pushing out to give birth, how much pain and suffering they go through. How you can't just take that away. And what atheists say, if they do say there's no God, and if you put the power in their hands, then there's no difference. So I always think about it as thinking that they still do believe in God because they're saying so many things about him, that why is he doing this, why is he doing that. So if they take God out, why are those things still happening? And they can't change that, and they can never change that. It will always happen. So suffering will always be a part of human nature and the world, how it works.
The thing, towards the end of this passage, Khalifa Rabi gives a really good response to atheists, because obviously they believe in the idea of chance, don't they? So if you don't believe in God, then you have no basis to even argue anything about suffering, because your basis for creation is chance mutations, chance events. Then you can't blame God for anything because your creator is chance. Therefore, you have no one to blame or to complain to about suffering, because your creator is chance, basically. So just continuing from that, if everyone was as equal as possible, then again it becomes relative. So one baby is born maybe looking more beautiful, more attractive than another. Then that baby or that child, as they grow up, will think to themselves, oh, my features aren't as appealing as this other person's features. Then that will be the main cause of suffering. So it's all about perspective, and those inequalities of health and looks will agonize people forever. We even see it now when people want to change their face, like bodies, because of something they're upset that they don't like about themselves. So it's all perspective based, and it will never end. There's no way to solve that question, so to speak. If you have absolute justice, then everyone is identical in every way, in every form of health, like just being completely identical in every way. But then there's no diversity there, and the reality is then there's no point in existence then. So I think this is the best quote, really. Wherever there's variety and diversity, comparative suffering and happiness are bound to be generated. So without diversity, it's just monotony. Everything's the same, and then there's no point in existence. There's no point in our being here. There's no point in our creation.
then there's another challenge to atheists as well, just this bit at top. One may object to the plan of things in the name of compassion for disabled children, but to replace the plan with a more just and compassionate, viable plan is quite another thing. So you can say to an atheist, okay, you don't like this much suffering in the world. What's your solution? How would you make things different? And if you ponder over it, you can challenge them as they want, but they won't be able to replace Allah's creation, Allah's purpose with a better one. Even if you just pose that question to them, they won't have a good answer. And as I just mentioned, Buddha Bisab, there should be no problem to resolve from the atheist perspective. If chance is the creator, no creator is accountable to them. There's no God who's accountable to them. For every suffering or misery, this only chance can be blamed. The outcome of chance without creator has to be blind and disorderly. How many mutations go wrong if you look at the history of science? So there's no reason, there's no direction, there's no design. So your creator is chance, so you have no one to complain to about suffering. And then if you're a believer in God, the answer should also be quite straightforward. You should see the balance, the perspective in creation, the idea of a life after death. And though there are hardships and it hurts us all, you have to submit to the wisdom of the plan, the grand scheme of the plan, which is life after death. Does someone else have a question?
What about genetic disorders? Since we believe Allah directed evolution, does that mean like such disordered were Allah made them to be? And how do we answer this argument?
I think it's a little bit like, again, those children born with those disorders, whether it be illness from a young age leads to problems with health and well-being and medical conditions. But I think it's a similar sort of answer where you'll say nothing's happened obviously without Allah's allowing it to be, but it's a matter of perspective. As this person's suffering, for a person who believes in God, you know that those innocent who suffer, there's a life after death and they'll be rewarded with eternal paradise. If you don't believe in God, then again, you don't have a position to say anything, do you? Because you don't believe there's a creator, and then these things are happening by chance mutations, by chance events, and most mutations go wrong anyway, deletion, insertion mutations with genes and things like that. So in those cases, because you don't believe in God, who are you complaining to about the suffering is what? That's how I'd go about it personally. I don't know if someone wants to add anything.
Yeah, no, like with Allah Ta'ala, He always promises compensation, and the compensation for anyone who suffers in this world is the hereafter. Mm-hmm. And for people, it's very difficult for someone who's disabled or can't physically pray or think. Allah says that in the hereafter, they will be in their perfect form, and they'll be living a life of eternity. So sometimes some people will suffer in this world, but like we said, Allah will replenish that in the hereafter. And those trials and tribulations are not only for that child, it's for the people around them as well, and it allows them to adopt sincerity and help them on that path as well. So there's endless, the causes are endless, but on the flip side, Allah will always have a better life in place. And that's why we always say focus on the end goal. Don't just judge straight away about what you see and blame people. Always see the bigger picture of why it's happened.
Then what about this scenario where the other person does believe in God? So how do we answer this to another person who believes in God?
In what? I don't understand. Sorry.
The same question, kind of like back to the first question. I mean, the answer was like, if we were to ask an atheist, we would ask about like talking about God, like how do you explain this suffering? But what if the other person we're talking is in fact someone who believes in God? So how do we address it then?
Well, if he believes in God and he has a certainty in God's attributes, his existence, and his perfection as a being, as a creator, then, as Murabi Saab said, I think it's just looking at what is the end goal. Yes, there were these hardships created, but through that process of evolution, it's led to the betterment of human beings in terms of understanding of medical conditions, understanding of managing these diseases and these processes. And despite that person suffering, they will be rewarded in life after death, and they should have that certainty, God, to understand that, is what I'm trying to say. And if they don't, that's how I would say it anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, Jazakallah.
And I think that fits in nicely with this bit. For the believer in God, death has the role of the redeemer. As a life after death, innocent sufferers will be granted near of unlimited reward. And then, as I said, for those who don't believe in God, they won't find any satisfaction in that answer. If they don't have a faith in the Creator, then the injustices that they see, they won't be satisfied that there's any goodness or justification for it, because they don't believe in the Creator. And then there's no conversation that can be had with them in that regard anyway. And all those things about right and wrong morality, it all links to suffering and hardship. Right and wrong morality, it all comes from a place with a belief in the existence of God. Without that belief in the existence of God, it's very, I don't say it's easy, but it becomes easy to justify anything, so to speak. And yeah, I know I've said it so many times, but if there's no God, we can't blame him. If there's no God for an atheist, we can't blame him for that suffering. And it has to be accepted as part of nature and part of the evolutionary process for us. And then another way to look at it is, if you think of the majority of people in the world, despite the suffering, whatever, say it's people living with dementia, people living with other illnesses, Alzheimer's, motor neuron diseases, most of them, if you took a poll from most of them, if you ask them, do you want to end your life now, have euthanasia and end your life, or would you rather keep living? I think the statistics will show the vast majority will want to keep living. So in spite of that suffering, in spite of that misery, in spite of that hardship, the vast majority still want to cling to life and keep going. So it's to say that even despite the suffering, there's far more blessings and goodness in the world versus the suffering. Yeah, I think I've touched on this quite a little bit already. As we are higher forms of life, a higher sense of awareness, and even, yeah, with lots of faculties, it will result in suffering. So it only comes from a place of appreciating what we once had. If you lived in a very nice, expensive house, and then you lose that house for, financial difficulties, you experience that suffering. Only you have the awareness of the happiness and the goodness, and once you lose it, that's when you experience suffering. So it can't be there without one, can't be there without the other. Basically, you can't have happiness without suffering. Yeah, I'm just trying to finish off as quickly rather than keeping rambling on. But I just want to read this little bit out at the end as well. Suffering is embedded in the sense of deprivation. Loss of some familiar cherished values leads to the sense of pain. It can only happen when one has tasted such values and pleasures or observed others enjoying them. So without happiness, there can be no suffering, and vice versa. Yeah, and it's just reiterating the same thing here as well. Remove one and the other disappears, and it's beyond the reach of human compassion to erase suffering without erasing life itself. So you need suffering for the persistence and the progress of life. Without it, life can't progress, and life actually can't begin and start. If we go back to the idea of bacteria, and all of our organs, all of our senses have progressed and developed due to those encounters of loss and gain, of goodness, of badness, of hardship, of trial. They've progressed to where we are now because of those encounters. And that's everything there, boys. Jazakallah.
I think it's important to know for Muslims as well. Allah made it very clear that He says that we will be tried with with our wealth, with our life, with our thamarat, all the good things in this world being taken away from us. So it's really, really important to have that in the back of our minds. And Allah has never said that you will live a life of perfection. So when you're treading on the path of righteousness, and if you look at the most righteous people, the Holy Prophets, all the prophets, they all, and you ask yourself, why did they have to go through such hard times? And that's completely up to the will of Allah and His Sunnah, and how He put them on that path to do that. And you can say the same thing now for for coronavirus. And one of the comments as well, can this be said for coronavirus as well? We never know what the will of Allah is, but everything, as we said, with suffering causes us to gain some sort of success and progress. And we never know, this might be a time in our lives where we need to look at ourselves and progress in different capacities. So yeah, we'll find out maybe later on in our life. But for now, we can see how the world has reacted and how the world has come together in these more times. And we hear so many stories about how people have turned towards Allah because they've lost hope in scientists and seeking out a greater being to get them through such difficult times. So yeah, Jazakallah Hamza, I think that was a pretty good effort from your side, and it's good to hear other people's comments and voices as well. If anyone does have anything to say, it'll be good to hear from you guys. If not, then we can definitely move on to the next thing. Hamza, any last words from that, and any pieces of advice you can give?
No one ever grew from a comfort zone. I think that's the key thing. So in your worldly endeavors, in your spiritual endeavors, no one ever progressed when things were easy, when things were straightforward. There's no growth in that. There's no purpose to life in that. There's no development in that. Whether it be a hard exam for going to uni, whether it be waking up for tahajjud, there's no progress without hardship. So there's very little to, if your life's easy, there's probably, if life's very easy for you, you're probably not doing enough, or you're not doing much, if that makes sense.
You're just
Not to offend anyone, but if life's easy for you, then you probably need to be doing something more or something different. That's how I look at it personally.
Definitely. Always set targets and always try to achieve them, even if the world's against you. If you feel like you're doing it for the right cause, and if you're doing it for the cause of Allah, just like as we said today, whatever you lose, just make sure you're always sincere to Allah, and always keep Him close. If Allah's always looking for a reaction from us, and what is a trial? A trial is so that you get through the other side successfully. The way Muslims see it as a success is if you've hold that trust and full certainty in Allah that whatever happens, it will make us into better people and closer to Allah. Then that's a gain for you. So yeah, Jazakallah Hamza.